Hello and welcome back to Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion. In this third segment, we're going to stick with Jewish responses to the problem of evil, this time focusing on a modern response to what happened in the Holocaust, which was the Nazi program to kill all Jews in Europe. Although Jews were not the only group targeted in the Holocaust, they were the principal one and suffered by far the biggest losses, around 6 million in all. Now, this is not the place to go into the details of what happened, some of which are likely to be familiar to you anyway, such as the different methods of execution used in the concentration camps, the medical experiments performed by Nazi doctors, and so on. The fact of the Holocaust is what concerns us, rather than the details. Now, the fact that Jews had been targeted because of their religion, and had been killed in such large numbers in such horrific ways, obviously led to a lot of deep reflection in the aftermath, reflection that is still ongoing. How could God allow such a thing to happen? Why was there no divine intervention, no attempt to prevent or stop the massacre? To be sure, Jews have had to ask similar questions for much of their history, because they have frequently been persecuted throughout the world. And if you want to get a sense of how frequently Jewish communities have been persecuted, Google the word pogrom, or anti-Jewish pogrom. A pogrom is a term used to describe collective violence directed against Jews. So although persecution was nothing new to the Jews, the sheer scale of the Holocaust gave greater urgency to questions about God's justice. And you might think that the Holocaust would be reason enough for the Jews to conclude that God does not exist, or at least that the God of Judaism does not exist. While there were undoubtedly Jews who did draw such a conclusion, many did not. Instead, Jewish thinkers came up with a variety of different responses, which did not involve denying the existence of God. In the remainder of this segment, we'll look at one of these responses, which is found in the work, and indeed the person, of Elie Wiesel. Wiesel was born in northern Romania, in a town which fell under Nazi control in 1944. When he was 15, Wiesel was sent to Auschwitz, along with his family and the rest of the Jewish community from his hometown. Near the end of the war, he was sent to Buchenwald. About a decade after being liberated, he wrote a book called Night, a harrowing account of his time in the concentration camps, and the library has this, but be warned, it's not a pleasant read. Now, Wiesel wrote many other works as well, and the question of how to understand God as good and just, given the innocent suffering in the world, was one he returned to often. It's the question at the heart of the work we're going to focus on here, which is a play called The Trial of God. As the title suggests, the play involves putting God on trial. Wiesel claims that it was based on an event that actually happened during his time in Auschwitz. While he was there, he befriended an expert on the Talmud, the book of Jewish religious law. And one night this person introduced him to two other Jewish scholars, and the three experts proceeded to put God on trial, with the teenage Wiesel as the only witness. This is what happened next. The trial lasted several nights. Witnesses were heard, evidence was gathered, conclusions were drawn, all of which issued finally in a unanimous verdict. The Lord God Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, was found guilty of crimes against creation and humankind. And then, after what Wiesel describes as an infinity of silence, the Talmudic scholar looked at the sky and said, "It's time for evening prayers." Decades later, Wiesel claimed that the actual trial in Auschwitz didn't find God guilty as such, but rather sheyav, or liable, which means that he owes us something. Nevertheless, it's a startling thought. Putting God on trial, securing a conviction, or at least issuing a condemnation, and then going to pray to the very same God as if nothing had happened. Wiesel's play, The Trial of God, is not set during the Holocaust, but in 1649 in a small town in Ukraine called Shamgorod. Most of the Jews in the town have been killed by Christian mobs in previous years, and now there are only a handful left, one of whom is the play's main character, a Jewish innkeeper called Berish. And Berish lost most of his family to the mobs. And this has left him broken, angry, and feeling abandoned by God. On the day of a Jewish festival, Berish decides he wants to celebrate the festival by staging a trial of God. Berish takes on the role of prosecutor and he ropes in some minstrels to serve as judges. But he struggles to find someone to take on the role of God's defense advocate until a stranger called Sam agrees to do it. The trial begins with Berish laying out the charges against God: hostility, cruelty, and indifference towards the Jews. So Berish says either he knows what's happening to us or he doesn't wish to know. In both cases, he is guilty. Sam, the defense advocate, then offers various arguments to defend God against these charges, and we'll get to these in a moment. Now, then the trial gets interrupted when a Christian priest drops by to let them know that a murderous mob is forming outside, intent on killing the remaining Jews in the town. The priest suggests that a sham conversion to Christianity might be enough to save the Jews from the mob, but Berish refuses on the grounds that the other members of his family died without betraying their faith, so he will do the same. The trial resumes, but is then interrupted again because the murderous mob is getting close. With death now near, Berish doubles down on the line he has taken. On the one hand, he won't consider giving up his faith, but on the other, he intends to continue protesting about God's guilt. So he says, I lived as a Jew, and it's as a Jew that I shall die, and it's as a Jew that with my last breath I shall shout my protest to God. And because the end is near, I shall shout louder. Because the end is near, I'll tell him that he's more guilty than ever. And the play ends with the mob about to enter the inn and slaughter the Jews inside. The actual trial of God is never completed, so no verdict is reached. But given how the play ends with the Jews about to be killed, one assumes Wiesel wants us to agree with Berish and declare God guilty. And one could in fact interpret the ending as God deliberately interrupting the trial to avoid the guilty verdict that otherwise seems inevitable. Now this is just a brief synopsis, so it glosses over much of the play's depth and richness. But it's worth noting that the play has clear echoes of the book of Job that we saw in the last segment. And this comes out in three very clear ways. First of all, the overriding question at the heart of the play: where is God in all this? That's clearly reminiscent of Job, who likewise wondered why a just God allows the innocent to suffer. The second connection between the play and the book of Job is that the play's main character, Berish, is clearly modelled on Job. Like Job, Berish is innocent. He tells us, I'm an honest man, I've never stolen, I've never cheated, I've never humiliated anyone. I have done only good. And during the trial itself, Berish says, again echoing Job, I had everything and everything was taken away from me. And there's another echo of Job when Berish says that he intends to rail against God to make his protest known. And a further echo of Job occurs near the end of the play, when a Christian mob come to kill all of the Jews in the inn. The Christian priest gives Berish the opportunity to renounce his faith and save his own life in the process, but Berish refuses. In spite of all he's been through and in spite of what's going to happen to him, Berish insists on sticking with his faith. He continues to protest, he continues to pronounce God guilty, but at no point does Berish entertain the thought that God does not exist. In short, Berish is happy to denounce God, but not to renounce God. And Job did much the same. A third connection between Wiesel's play and the book of Job can be found in the character of Sam, the only one prepared to serve as God's defense advocate. Sam, in fact, turns out to be Satan, something that is hinted at during the course of the play, but becomes clear only right at the very end. And in itself, this is a sobering thought. Wiesel may be suggesting here that only someone inherently evil would want to defend God. Well, Sam's defense of God makes use of a number of traditional ways of explaining why there is evil in the world. Sam suggests that God's justice may not be the same as human justice, such that what we take to be unjust may in fact be just in God's eyes. When asked to justify the previous massacre of Jews in Shamgarad, Sam says simply that it's a case of humans killing other humans, so why involve God? Sam then wonders whether those who were massacred might actually have been pleased to die because it meant entering heaven. Sam then suggests that if we cannot understand why there is evil in the world, this is probably because we do not understand the way God thinks. In which case, the only thing we can do is endure and accept. Now, bearing in mind that Sam is Satan, one could read his attempts to justify God as Wiesel telling us that it's wrong, satanic even, to try to explain or justify God's actions or inactions. And there's something of a parallel with the book of Job here. As we'll remember from the last segment, Job's friends come up with various explanations as to why God allowed him to suffer. And at the end of the book, God criticizes the friends for not telling the truth. It's as if God does not approve of rational attempts to explain innocent suffering. And it seems Wiesel would agree, given that he gives the job to Satan in the play. Like the book of Job, Wiesel's The Trial of God is inconclusive. It raises questions, often very difficult questions, but it provides no clear answers. One such question concerns God's power and goodness. If God is indeed guilty of hostility, cruelty, and indifference towards the Jews, what implications does that have for our conceptions of God's power or goodness? Well, through the character of Berish, Wiesel seems unwilling to challenge the traditional idea that God is omnipotent, or at least almighty. It's even affirmed when Berish asks of God, is he powerless? He's almighty, isn't he? He could use his might to save the victims, but he doesn't, so on whose side is he? Could the killer kill without his blessing, without his complicity? Now that suggests that God has the power to stop injustices and suffering, but just doesn't want to. If God is indeed on the side of the killers, as would seem to be the case, given that no attempt is made to stop them, then this suggests God is lacking in goodness. In essence, God has taken the wrong side. But can this really be the moral that Wiesel wants to draw from the play and from the Holocaust more broadly? If it was, then it makes you wonder why Berish bothers protesting in the first place. After all, protesting to God is in effect an appeal to God's goodness, an appeal that one hopes will ultimately change God's mind. But if Berish and Wiesel genuinely thinks that God is not good, then there's no reason to suppose that protesting to God will have any effect. The very act of protesting seems to presuppose the goodness of whoever it is you're protesting to. So Wiesel's play leaves us with the awkward idea of a God who is good, as well as hostile, cruel and indifferent. A God who could intervene to sort out the world's problems, but for some reason chooses not to. This appears to be the God that Wiesel himself believed in, certainly from his time in Auschwitz onwards. While it's notable that Wiesel never gave up his faith, we must remember that for a large part of his life, Wiesel was anything but a traditional believer. His was an uncomfortable faith, consisting of a belief in God that was for a long time combined with great anger and hostility towards God. For Wiesel, anger at God is a perfectly acceptable Jewish response. And certainly there is a strand of Jewish thought that permits this, partly thanks to Job's lengthy complaints and displays of anger against God. And interestingly, in an essay on the book of Job, Wiesel suggested that even after God had appeared and restored Job's fortunes, Job should not have backed down. He should have continued to vent his anger at God's injustice. The idea seems to be that God is still in the wrong even after making things right. But Wiesel's complicated relationship with God did not stop at anger and hostility. He even thought it acceptable for Jews to be against God, provided they retained their faith. As you probably know, Judaism does permit quite a lot of latitude in how one thinks of and relates to God. Some people have even suggested that Wiesel hated God. So small wonder that, as one person puts it, for Wiesel, it's God's existence rather than God's non-existence that's the problem. The dilemma is created by belief, not disbelief. His agony over the question of God is the agony of the believer. Wiesel's hatred of God, if that's what it was, and his righteous anger towards God, did not last for the whole of his life. The play we've looked at, The Trial of God, marked the end of that. The play was published in 1979, and after that, Wiesel's anger towards God seems to have evaporated, at least for the most part, and his complaints against God turned into gentle questions for God. Questions that he presumably thought God would struggle to answer, as much as we struggle to answer them. Nevertheless, Wiesel's earlier work, up to and including The Trial of God, characterized as it is by anger and protest, gave birth to what has become known as protest theodicy. Wiesel probably would not have liked his views being characterized as a theodicy, because theodicy is traditionally associated with rationalizations and justifications, with explaining God and trying to get God off the hook. And these are the very things Wiesel was against. But protest theodicy isn't a traditional kind of theodicy that offers a rational explanation for why God allows us to suffer, or any kind of justification of God. Instead, as its name suggests, protest theodicy involves protest against God's silence and inaction, as well as protest against traditional attempts to explain or justify God's decision to allow evil and suffering. And that certainly does capture the approach Wiesel took for much of his life, as well as that found in the character of Berish in The Trial of God. So where does this leave us? Well, if we're looking for easy answers to the problem of human suffering, we won't find them in the work of Wiesel. In fact, we won't find them in any of the Jewish responses to the Holocaust. The Holocaust posed Judaism a very difficult question, and Jewish thinkers are not inclined to think that there is an easy answer. The scale of the problem should be clear from Wiesel, whose faith survived in spite of, or perhaps only because of, the great hostility and perhaps even hatred with which it was for a long time combined.